Hello, and welcome to podcast number 5 of What Moves Us. So I'm Liam Henderson.
I'm Johannah Liam.
And I'm Giles Perkins from WSP.
We have a guest.
I'm the guest.
So thank you for having us here today.
You're welcome.
But we didn't say where we are.
That is true.
We are at WSP's headquarters on Chancery Lane near Holborn.
And for those people who don't know what WSP is,
we are an international consulting company of around about, I think, 44,000 strong across the world, about 8,000 people in the UK.
And your position is?
I am the grandly titled Head of Future Mobility.
And of those 40,000 people, how many people are you the boss of?
Boss is a horrible term, isn't it? I have a small team of people around the UK, and there are similar to me in the other territories as well. So we have kind of future mobility technology experts around the different territories. So we're kind of more of a community rather than a big sort of cohesive blob of people.
Right.
So that's a really nice way of putting it. So how did you get into future mobility?
So I am a transport planner by background. And about 7 years ago, I was given the opportunity to do business development in Mouchel, Mouchel was purchased by WSP a few years ago, in the technology business. And we were looking at what were the changes that were going to happen and what did that mean for transport, everything around about 3 years away. So we started to look at electrification of road vehicles, we started to look at digital connectivity, we started to look at automation. And that kind of developed into some very, very early thinking all those years ago around what might the changes in transport be and what might that mean for our customers, our networks, our vehicles, everything. So this was all kind of a little bit under the radar, that there weren't many people talking about it then. So that's evolved over time and got to the position now where future mobility has a strategy and it's becoming common parlance. So it's been a really interesting journey.
So on that topic, if it was under the radar and you were working on what was going to happen in the future, do you think you've influenced any of this future over the period?
I think there's been a lot of things have kind of coalesced coincidentally, some by planning, that lots of things have come together. So a lot of individuals like me who might have been in different sectors, so some in rail, some in transport planning, some in ITS, some in the built environment, kind of looking at each other and going, oh, you're thinking a little bit like me, and people kind of putting two and two together and realising they had some chums, and over time this has coalesced into what's become kind of a much bigger thing now in terms of how we consider mobility in its widest sense. So I think it's a little bit of design, a lot of coincidence, and a lot of enthusiasm.
Okay. So just before we get on to the meaty detail of today's podcast, we asked you as our guest because you were the presenter for the July meetup of the Rail Innovation Group about future mobility.
Which did have nice Monster Munch, I will say, and great snacks. Go to those events, they've got great snacks.
We are known for our Monster Munch. Cody Whirlies as well. We're still trying to find wagon wheels.
You don't get wagon wheels anymore.
It's really hard.
You can, but they've got smaller.
Oh, we've got bigger.
What I was very interested in that presentation is the fact that one of the central things you said is that policy is guiding us towards making sure that despite all these exciting future modes, exciting technologies, walking and cycling should be sort of
at the centre.
At the centre of this thing as the gateway to these other modes.
Yes.
Which I thought was very refreshing. But so probably the first question I have is walking and cycling policy being developed to be as sophisticated as future mobility in general policy?
I think it's an interesting point. So the future of mobility urban strategy is the one that says that walking and cycling should remain the dominant mode, if you like, for short distance journeys. I think that's interesting because it negates that sort of dystopian view of, a bit like the end of WALL-E, we'll all be riding round in our pods, tapping at our 36-inch screens, not talking to everybody. What I really liked about that statement that was included from the department is that it keeps future mobility at a human scale. So it ties future mobility to the environments in which it's serving, and it firmly places the human at the centre of it. So thinking about walking and cycling as being desirable, social, healthy activities, surely we want to have healthy communities that are out enjoying the landscape, be that the city streets of London or be it rural places, etc. So I think it's getting really interesting that on the one hand you could say that future mobility would be an anathema to that, and it would be actually the worst possible thing, but I think by the department putting some red lines and boxing things, it says actually what we want is we want livable cities, we want streets that serve people. Future mobility will have use cases and things that will improve people's lives, but let's not forget that walking and cycling are activities that are desirable. It keeps us healthy, it keeps us energised, it improves our mental health, all of these sorts of things that we know. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've actually got some fantastic things to build upon. So future mobility for me is about building upon the good stuff that we've done to get to these places and thinking about how we integrate technology and digital and all these things into a vision for the future that serves us as at a human scale.
Right. And do you sense there's conflict in terms of people trying to effectively get their future mobility, whatever it is, scooters or anything else, to people's front doors?
I think you could perceive it as it depends on which filter you look through. You could perceive it as a conflict and say, in a very pure way, well, actually, we don't want those because everybody should be walking or they should be riding their own bikes, or we shouldn't have e-bikes because everyone should be riding a manual bike. And that's a whole that's a 3-hour discussion in itself as to the pros and cons. The way
we can talk about my electric bike.
Yes, brilliant advocate. So for me, it comes down to, if we think about the different use cases, if we think about the different types of people, so there are people that electric bikes are a fantastic gateway to cycling. There are people for whom the electric bike gives them mobility in ways that they've never had before. And I see people where I live in rural southwest people riding bikes that would never be riding bikes because they've got electric assist. That for me is fantastic, because it means that those people are getting out into the air, into the surroundings and observing things. There are people undoubtedly that, subject to legislation, that the electric scooter might be a great point-to-point solution. I think we need to be careful of homogenising society and saying, well, one size will fit all. And I think this is where the future mobility agenda is really interesting, because it it provides us with a way of providing multiple choices to people at different times, not only in terms of their life stages, but also in terms of their economics, where they live, all these sorts of things. So thinking that just because we've got future mobility intervention X in a city, that doesn't mean I'm going to have it in rural Devon, because the use case will be different, the population's different, but there might be things that we have in rural Devon that we never ever see in London. And that's where I get really interested, that the choices that we've had traditionally in terms of walk, cycle, taxi, bus, rail, plane, are actually going to get a lot more congested and a lot more blurry. So we have a lot more choices that might actually improve people's lives in different ways.
I like the fact that when you were describing that, you were talking about the different needs. And I think as transport planners, we haven't necessarily thought about people's needs. It's been about trying to get that one-size-fits-all type scenario. So has talking about mobility actually changed the language in that sense?
I think it's really interesting. I'm unfortunate that at the very early part of my life I had experiences that led me to think differently. So I spent 6 months of my early life in a wheelchair. So this was in the sort of early 80s, when there was no disabled access and it was hard to get around, and I was dependent upon my parents, and I experienced transport and cities in a very restricted way. Okay. That kind of set me in train with a very different mindset about thinking about mobility. So I've always been wired this way, and I started my early career on Merseyside. I spent 10 years on Merseyside working for Merseytravel, doing some really fantastic things, who were the absolute kind of at the forefront of the disability agenda. I was trained in a way of thinking about people, and I've carried that all the way through, which is, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. So thinking for me about that segmentation of how old are you, where do you live, what are your physical constraints, what are your monetary constraints, what are your social filters that you experience, all those sorts of things, all influence the decisions that people make, the decisions that they don't make, the things that they have access to or perceive they have access to. So getting into this space of thinking about it in a much more mature way really excites me, because given that we may have this incredible set of choices, actually that starts to open up some of the challenges that we've had before and really start to unlock mobility in its widest sense. And the e-bike is a great example. On the face of it, I'm a cyclist. I used to be a competitive cyclist until a couple of years ago. A whole bunch of people saying e-bikes are cheating, that's no good, it's rubbish. No, e-bikes are fantastic because it keeps people who have been excluded, people that are getting more elderly. I've got arthritis in my feet and in my hip at the moment, and I worry about my mobility. When I get an e-bike, when I move to that, it'll be fantastic. I can carry on riding and carry on going down the Devon Hills and going off-road and all those sorts of things. Brilliant. It allows people to do things that they might not have done before, and I think that's the great kind of analogy for future mobility, is it might allow people to do things differently that they've never previously been able to do.
I think it's interesting, sort of like that whole thing about e-bikes being cheating, because I have an e-bike, but I also have 2 other bikes too, and that's about me making different choices according to what I'm doing on that journey, just in the way I make a choice between getting a car or getting a train. And it's because if I want to get around just as quickly as if I was in a car, the e-bike actually is very handy to be able to do that in a city centre. You can get around but if I'm getting on the train, I actually want my Brompton with me so that I can cycle at the other end. But if I'm doing sporting activity, I actually go out on my proper road bike because I'm doing it for my health.
That's the interesting bit. So you're describing the use cases for the sub-modes of transport that you're doing. And I think that's where the future mobility gets interesting, because we will have different passenger use cases, different freight use cases that might lead us to different choices at different times, and that range of choices being bigger than we've ever had. So you will have, your own car, or car share, or ride share, or whatever, that all these different flavours start to become options for us to do things in a different way.
Which is a bit of a challenge for traditional planners and officials who like to sort of plan for one thing. This is the appropriate mode for that distance.
And I think it's even harder if you think about the trajectory as an industry we've been on. So we had canals, and then canals were replaced by railways, and then we had the motorway network come along, we had the beaching cuts on railways, and we've seen these changes. I'm an advocate of future mobility in its widest sense, and thinking about the disruptions that might come could be as seismic as when the motor car came along the first time around, as seismic as when the railways impacted the canals. The problem is at the moment that as planners, we've got our boxes that tell us to do certain things, and we've got our toolkit that has certain things in the toolkit. We like to reflect backwards and measure things and collect data, whereas at the moment the pace of change is such that we don't even know what the future looks like. We haven't got a backwards looking data set to go from, and when we open our toolkit, there's not that many things left in there because we're not appropriate. It's like taking a set of hammers to go and fix a computer. So we have to think differently, and I think that's where it gets interesting, that lots of people are starting to think very differently about how you might plan for these things, how you might plan in a more agile way of how you integrate these things in the built environment, and use some of the experiences of how place has responded to change, or how different cities have encouraged change, and then apply those to the future mobility space.
So would you say though that you obviously work as a consultant to clients, I'm assuming the public sector
and private sector.
Public and private sector. So would you say that you are a bearer of good news or bad news, in terms of you have clients who say, we think this is the thing that we want, and you have to come along and say, well, there's a whole load of implications that you have thought about? Or is it more of the case of, all these things could liberate you from these problems?
I think it's really interesting because it's both. and it can be both at the same time, and that's really challenging. So if you think about, it depends upon on what time scale you're looking over the exam question. So if you're thinking about a long-term asset, of which there are numerous long-term assets around the country, various long-term assets. If you think about how those new things that we're building might change over time, this is where it gets really interesting, because what you're having to deal with, it's not like designing something in the 70s knowing that we had buses and taxis and trains and bikes and cars. What we're saying is, well, you might have a bit of scooter, and you might have some drones, and you might have Hyperloop, and you might have this over a conceivable 100-year life. How the hell do you take cognizance of that? So moving to a much more agile approach of how we think about infrastructure as corridors, how we think about places as adaptable places, how we think about building in capacity, whether that's digital capacity or physical capacity, into the assumptions and the designs that we make. Yeah. That's how we start to address that, because I said this when we did when I did the presentation of a few weeks ago. I'm not going to stand up and say I think there will be 3,612 of something in Workington in 2023.
Yeah.
But what I will say is there might be these changes that happen in Workington and its environs, which means that we have to think about how we design our highways and our rail stations in a slightly different way. So rather than trying to predict the end state, what we're saying is we can see the trajectories of change, and we need to start thinking differently about how we design, how we put our components together, so it gives us some latitude to change later. That was a random emergency there.
Yeah.
It's all part of the charm.
Absolutely. So I think it's a different mindset to not being so rigorous about what the absolute end state is. And I used a very clumsy analogy yesterday. So WSP designs an awful lot of tall buildings around London. So when we design a tall building, let's have a hypothetical 20-storey building that might be mixed use, and it might have office in, and it might have residential in it, and it might have some retail in it. What we don't do when we design that building is say, right, in the basement we're going to put a coffee shop, and that coffee shop will have 15 seats in it, and those seats, some of them will be some comfy seats, and they'll have cushions on, and some will be metal seats. And what we'll do is we will sell bananas in the morning, and we will sell muffins in the afternoon, and we'll sell sandwiches. And then when we go to the residential, what we'll do is we'll have these flats and this, and you'll have a sofa that's of this type, and the carpets will be green, and all the rest of it. Yet in transport, we try and second guess what the customer wants at the end when we're specifying these long-term specifications. And I think this is where it gets interesting, that we need to move in transport to be much more agile around the softer service-based things that might change as we design our infrastructure to flex with what those endpoints could be, which is very different from a tall set of specifications.
And it's very difficult as well, because the clients, whether it be the transport provider, a local authority or government or whatever, like to buy tangible assets, don't they? They find it very difficult to plan for
an uncertain future.
An uncertain future, absolutely, because having sat in that client position, when I say I want an outcome, it's I'm told I don't know what I want, when actually I do know what I want. I want to buy flexibility of an uncertain future.
Yes. So to give you an example, projects I've worked on in the past, rather than describing we want a route from here to here, we've said we want to move 15,000 people per hour from here to here. We don't necessarily care whether that has a rubber tyre or a steel wheel. We want to deliver an outcome which is linking these two places together, and the purpose of linking these two places together is to encourage economic activity and investment in jobs and all the rest of it. You could approach that and say, we want a railway, we want it to be a two-track railway, we want to have this type of signalling, we want it to have blue trains some of the time and red trains some of the time, and you will serve cheese sandwiches at 4 o'clock on a Friday. That doesn't contribute to the outcome, and this is where it's really interesting. And I sometimes reflect back on the early part of my career when I started on Merseyside just after bus deregulation. Kind of prior to bus deregulation, lots of authorities will be designing buses, and they would say, well, we want to have a seat moquette of this colour, and we want to have bumpers of this shape, and we want to have this, that and the other. So rather than going and saying we want to have a bus that will move 70 people in this sort of throughput, they'd spend the time specifying the bumpers and the seat moquette and the type of light and all these fiddly bits, rather than well, actually, we could just go and buy that off the shelf, and actually it's about getting the quality of the vehicle.
The colour of stuff is the easy bit almost, isn't it? And I think that's one of the reasons why people focus on it.
Yes.
Because it's like, it makes it feel as though I'm actually contributing. That colour was down to me.
Well, yes, and I think that's, to be honest, that's a very human trait, isn't it? There's a whole thing around legacy, yes, absolutely.
What's your experience, from your work on major projects, HS2, in terms of adding flexibility for future uses of the space?
It's as I was saying, it's difficult because you're saying I want flexibility because and actually take it further back on and into context. At King's Cross, we did not think about the future at all. And so what you have at King's Cross now is you have this big open space in the middle of the station called a ticket office. Yeah. And I started working in King's Cross in 1999, and when I first scoped out the ticket office, the internet was still very early. There was no such thing as an iPhone, so apps weren't a thing, and we didn't have any ticket machines in the ticket office, so ticket machines weren't really a thing. And if you wanted to book a ticket without going to the counter, you phoned telesales in Newcastle.
Yes.
And in those days, the tickets from telesales to be collected from King's Cross used to come down on a train at 4 o'clock in the afternoon the day before. Yeah. So that was sort of like where we started off.
Probably just 20 years ago.
20 years ago. Then, so fast forward about to 2007, when we knew what we were going to be doing in the station, and it was like, that was where the ticket office was before the Second World War. Well, it closed in the 70s, but it had been destroyed by a bomb in the Second World War and also an IRA bomb, so it was a completely sort of like blank space behind there, restored as part of the redevelopment. And because it was a ticket office before, we were going to put the ticket office back then. And then when sort of like maybe a year before it opened, I just thought, what did we do? Yeah, because we were battling with English Heritage in terms of the design, because they wanted it to go back to being what it was in 1840 when the station originally opened. We wanted to do something reasonably technologically advanced because we had ticket machines now, and we could do some jazzy stuff. We weren't allowed to touch any of the walls or anything, so it was a battle to get it through planning. And then at the end of it, we were just like, why did we put it there? It should be a restaurant or a wine bar or something. And because we didn't future-proof it, there is no facilities in there to be able to put in the fact that, because there's no drainage in there, there's no air extraction required to turn it into a restaurant or something.
And I think that's a really important point at the heart of that, which is when thinking about, so going back in time, if you could do, or when we invent time machines, we'll be able to. So, are we doing this now, or have we done it before? So, if you could go back in time, what you would do is nobody would have challenged you if you'd said, actually, we're going to put some drainage to that space, and we're going to put a duct into that space, and we'll make sure the electrical supply to that space is capable of running a restaurant, etc., and we'll put a gas supply and some other things. People might have thought you were a bit crazy at the time to do that. But had you done that space now be able to be repurposed easily. And that's at the heart of kind of the wider WSP Future Ready offer that we have, of which Future Mobility is part of. Sometimes it's the very simple things that you can do that actually unlock things in the future. So one of the things we talk around an awful lot at the moment is car park design. I'm sure car park design is exciting. I'm sure that the car park design Christmas dinner is a riot for the profession. I can't get excited about it. What I get more excited about is, let's think about what that future car park might be in 20, 30 years' time. 20 years is always good, so it's 20 years since the rise of the internet. So if we're building a car park now, what might it be in the future? So if we just increase the head heights a bit, and if we move the ramps to the sides, and if we have flat floors, not tilted floors, and if we make sure that there's a core that can take services all the way through it, as car parking starts to decline, as it may, because we move to shared assets and we can move around in autonomous vehicles and all the rest of it, we don't want to be necessarily demolishing all our car parks, but if we can repurpose them like they've done down at Peckham, of putting a bar on the top, putting restaurants in there, bringing modular community functions into those spaces, suddenly assets that could have been designed that would have been redundant can actually be repurposed. And I think this is where it gets interesting. And I talked before about how we're a little bit more agile towards design. Some of this is really, really simple stuff. This isn't clever stuff. I'm not a clever person.
There are a number of places where car parks have been turned into buildings. So the office group in Kirby Street was a car park.
Yeah. And
then even Canary Wharf Shopping Centre keeps expanding into the car park.
Yes.
So few people are driving to the shopping centre, they just keep
taking them over. Do you think Canary Wharf thought about that when they started off, because being a commercial business, do you think they were thinking that?
No. I don't think so.
Because I know with some of the car parks have been done, it's been easier for some than others, because they've done the same with one in Soho as well, haven't they? They turned that into a hotel, is it? Or have they just completely knocked that down? I can't remember.
I'm not sure.
The Ham Yard Hotel, did that used to be a car park?
I did not know that.
I think it did.
Don't know.
But
it's very nice.
But it's a great analogy in terms of how you think around what any asset, how it might be used now.
Yeah.
And you think about sort of...
But another one is all the Georgian townhouses are now offices, and people like having their little boutique offices in Georgian townhouses.
Yes,
they're
absolutely.
perfect for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long will it be before they turn back into homes? Because we don't need offices anymore.
True.
Yeah.
So just in terms of transport planning, because that is, agility is very radical in terms of providing that, but also another way that we've been very fixated is that, because a lot of what you're talking about is planning for the need and the end-to-end journey. Whereas a lot of what we do is transport planners, is we talk about groups of people, as in commuters and leisure users and business users.
Yeah, or even worse, types of vehicles that may or may not have people in them, yes.
So how do we move that message along in order to get the outcomes that we're seeking for future mobility?
I think it's really interesting, because just let's go back to thinking about the internet and how the internet's changed everything. So the immediacy of us as customers and our expectations. So the fact that you can buy whatever you want and you know that it may come today or certainly tomorrow. The fact that you can book a restaurant table through an app, the fact that you can buy a train ticket through an app. So that customer immediacy thing starts to really make that connection for me about that we need to think about, and many of our clients are already doing this, we need to think about the role of mobility within a lifestyle. So within what you do in a day, or you do in a day, or I do in a day. And that's going to be based upon where I am in my age group and all those sorts of things. If we think about how transport serves our needs, so how transport can help me get the kids to school, how transport can get me to work, how transport can get me to the educational opportunities, or how it can get me to meeting my friends of an evening. That's very different from thinking about how do I get a person from a bus stop to the bus station, or how do I get a person from the curtilies of the train station onto the train to get them to King's Cross and then get them out of the other side, which was always my beef, and I love telling this one. When I started my career, time-served railwayman said to me the railways would be fantastic if they had no passengers, because the trains would run to time.
And they still say that.
Yes, and that really landed with me, because it annoyed me at the time, because it missed the point that people don't get the train. Some people get the train because they like getting the train, but people get the train to do other things. It's about seeing your friends, it's about learning, it's about getting to hospital, it's about getting to work, all those sorts of things. I think because of the change in the collective journey we've all made over the last 20 years of the smartphone being part of our lives, the internet being part of our lives, immediacy being part of our lives.
That's my phone.
That's your phone.
Got a bit of Frozen going on there.
Wow. Disney in the background. Excuse Johanna's phone.
Actually, no, it wasn't.
That was defying gravity.
It was defying gravity, yes. So sorry, I thought it was Frozen.
So I think, that's thrown me now.
Sorry.
Me.
So we'll pick up you. Rail would be a great place if it wasn't for passengers.
Yeah, so I think the moving to that the expectation that we expect things in a joined up way. So you can go on one of the numerous food apps and have your takeaway delivered to you in an instant and all this sort of thing. I think that starts to put pressure on the transport ecosystem as a whole, be it bus, rail, whatever, that actually it becomes about how I get from my home to get to work and the pieces in between, which is why the sort of very nascent discussions on mobility as a service and the slight utopia of what does that mean and how might it get us there. So we have, single payment platform, single booking, all these sorts of things coming together to remove those little pain points and friction in all that journey. That's about how we embed mobility within our lifestyles to improve our lives, and that for me has been the missing bit. Transport and mobility has never realised that actually it's such an important part of our lives and it could enrich our lives, but the opportunity's never been seized because it's been siloed into, is it a green train or a red train, or is it this paper ticket or that, and no one's ever thought about all the externalities and how they connect together.
Yes, and we did a podcast on mobility as a service, but picking up from your point, pulling two things together is, why would the mobility as a service app or platform stop at mobility? Why isn't it a lifestyle platform? Why isn't your dinner
That's a
included
whole
in it?
subject in itself. So if you look at, and I think I mentioned this when I did the presentation, you look at some of those places where smart ticketing has been integrated into lifestyle. So Japan, in Tokyo, with a transit card that now allows students to use that to check into their lessons. So it's the same pass that's doing multiple functions. Reading only this morning about Apple's, in inverted commas, credit card that will reside on the phone isn't just a credit card, it's a means of a unique identifier to allow you to use it for other functions. There are some people, very foresighted people, that are starting to use exactly that phrase, that it's about the lifestyle bit of which mobility is part. And I think that is fascinating, that we're starting to have a set of a nomenclature and language that starts to embed mobility. So for me, it would be awful phrase, lifestyle as a service, and that is a thing. There are people that will manage your lifestyle, so why wouldn't you manage your mobility as part of it? Whilst that might sound a bit dystopian, you can see the attractiveness. Well, actually, as humans, we don't go to that many places. We're very habitual animals. We go to certain locations, and if anybody listening has ever got into the quantified self community of measuring things, so we have Fitbits, some of us measure our movement data and where we're going. Once you start to collect lots of data about what you do personally, you realise that you don't go to that many places and you do very similar things, and it's no wonder that advertisers and stuff start to target us for things because they're collecting data and know what we do. So it's not beyond the wit of man to say actually we can tailor those mobility offers to meet what you're doing, because it will meet your needs in a better way. And I find that really interesting.
So is anyone emerging then offering sort of like that type of service then, in terms of thinking
Not in
about-
terms of that holistic. If I, there's a couple of things I'd bet the farm on if I won the lottery, and that'd be one of them. If you kind of went into that space and say, how do we really link transport with those externalities of what we're all doing?
Yeah,
that would be fantastic.
but do you think that'll blow the minds of most transport people who think that transport is separate from all of those lifestyle things?
I would hope that it depends on the age group of the transport people that you spoke to.
Right.
And I think that is driven by, coming back to your point about, the rise of the smartphone and the rise of the internet. So in my career, I've been very fortunate that I've had a lot of random things occur. So I had a side job working for one of the big American companies that came over in the 90s to launch commercial internet here. So I had a side job for 8 years. So I got to see the inside of the commercialities of the internet in the early 90s. And I remember being sat in an office down the Fulham Road in this city when people were visioning and saying, our vision in 20 years for the internet is that the internet is this thing where it will have radio, and it will have community, and it will have television, and it will have phone, and it will have all these other things, and you cannot conceive what it will be like. And I can remember the conversation then, and that's what it's now become.
Yeah.
And I think back to that conversation of 20 years ago on the Fulham Road and try to apply that thinking to what mobility will be like. And the seismic change could be as much as that commerciality of the internet.
I mean, when you put it like that, it kind of blows your mind, doesn't it? If you go back 20 years to think, when we were still, sort of like had the dialogue, with the noise and all the rest of it, that we could do all of these things now with it. So
there's a fantastic clip I saw the other day of Jeremy Paxman interviewing David Bowie, and Paxman saying to Bowie, "You're an internet advocate, what does that mean?" And Bowie's saying, this is 1999, "The internet will blow your mind as to what it is going to do to society." Paxman's retort was, "But it is just a tool, it's going to do nothing." And Bowie just smiles at him and says, "You can't imagine what it's going to do." And it almost makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck when you think about where we've got to with the internet and how pervasive it is through everything. If the change, heavily caveated if, in italics, underlined in bold, if the similar changes happen to mobility, the changes could be just as mind-blowing. But it's much more complicated because the internet came along to fill a vacuum and there was nothing there. We've got an existing set of mobility ecosystems. We've got existing systems and networks and lots of things. So it's a more gradual burn and a more messy change.
So what's your mind-blowing vision for the future of mobility then? If you were
for me in my lifetime, so I can only go in my lifetime. So what I would want, my vision of success looks like that ticketing doesn't exist in its existing form. So paper has gone, contactless has gone, that my mobile phone with my wallet on it is the way in which I get charged. So take my journey to here, for instance. So I would get on the bus outside my house and I would know when the bus was coming. I would know that I could get a seat on it and I would just walk onto it, and my account would know that I was on the bus. Because I'd pre-booked my train, when I got to the train station I would step off the bus, go through a barrierless station. I would pick up a coffee and it would know where I was and it would charge me for the coffee. I would get on the train and I had my seat reservation, and I would seamlessly go through this thing, maximising what I wanted to do in the time, rather than it being lots of bits of stress of paying for this, negotiating that, all those sorts of things, so that whether I choose to be productive in a traditional sense, i.e. working, or productive having quality time with my family, which is equally as productive and underrated, that what I'm doing and passing through that system is completely seamless, it is completely frictionless, and then at the end of the month I just get a statement like, I will get my credit card statement and it says you've done this, this, this and this, and all the apportionment is done by somebody else. I don't care, and I've said this so many times, when I use a washing machine, I put it on C and I put my washing in. I don't care how the inside of the washing machine works. I really don't care how the inside of transport works. I just want to be able to use it as easily as I can use anything else. So I go back to my early internet days when I had the screechy dial-up modem and I would be charged by the minute for the time used for the phone call. I would be charged by the minute for how long I was online. And then I would get two separate bills, which was, oh my God, the phone bills come, look how big it is. And oh my gosh, the internet bills come, look how much they've charged me. And you think now that you get a bundled service or you've got your mobile phone that's in your hand, you never think about the amount of voice minutes, the amount of text, the amount of data. Yeah. Why would we think about the amount of bus and cycle and train? It's entirely analogous to where we've come from in so many other things. It's just... transport's been very late to the party.
It does sound very dated when you put it like that, doesn't it? So what's preventing us from getting there?
I think, and again, let's take that comparator as a clumsy comparator, because the internet filled a vacuum of something that never existed. It was able to shape and form itself in a very agile, very quick way. If you think about the transition that we've come through of the various flavours of bus, the various flavours of rail, the transitions through air industry, these are industries that have got tens, hundreds of years of design behind them, of invested knowledge, of huge amounts of skills and experience, that there is an expectation that suddenly you can mash them together and everyone's going to find the answer. That isn't easy. You know, as we heard when I did the presentation, the challenges around the existing rail ticketing system. If you think about how you then integrate that with a fragmented bus ticketing system, let alone what you do with car parking and all these other things, on the face of it, it's, well, you just make all the data available and it'll all happily, magically, unicorn world come together and everything will be great. No, that's a huge, massive IT project to do all of that, which requires huge commitment and vision and investment and skill to do it. I don't doubt that it will come. It might not be in my lifetime, but it will come because it has come with everything else that we've done. Think about the transition of banking. The fact that when I got my first bank account, I had to go to the bank and fill out the form, and my parents were effectively vouching for me to become a NatWest customer. Other banks are available. Over that period, I went from having a checkbook with a check card, and you remember the old crunchy sort of things, and then you're moving to direct debit, and then you're moving to chip and pin, and then you're moving to contactless, and now you've moved to smartphone, and the fact that I can pay on my Fitbit.
Now open banking.
Yes. And, you know, there are those in the kind of open community that are fitting RFID tags to their bodies to do things. It's dystopian, but the art of the possible is significant, and it isn't beyond the wit of man that for those that choose to do so back to choice, those that choose to do so, the fact that we carry a mobile phone, the fact that we have banking on that phone, the fact that we have GPS on that phone intuitively feels like you can link those things together. The challenge comes in everybody within the ecosystem understanding that actually if you share data, it's not that you get a smaller slice of the pizza because you're giving it to your competitors. You can actually probably have a bigger pizza, because what you're doing is you are shifting the mobility market from private sole occupancy mobility with the thing that we've grown up with over the last 50 years and desired and fetishized, the car, to it being a more shared model which could grow. We need some evidence to do that. We need some great case studies to do that. We need some people to be doing the pilots and the investments and the things that are happening to start to give boardrooms and people the comfort that this is a new, sustainable, safe direction to go in.
So I think that's probably a last question then, is who's going to lead that future?
Everybody.
Everybody.
And I think there's a great quote, I think I put it at the beginning of that presentation, that Jesse Norman said when he launched the Future Mobility Strategy, about that the government needed help from industry to do it. And I've said this very publicly. I don't have the answers. Consultants don't have the answers. The operators don't have the answers. The government don't have the answers. The local authorities don't have the answers. It's only if we come together and say, actually, what does a better, and it sounds like a real hippie-ish thing to say, what does a better future look like given the tools that we've got? So going back to opening up my empty toolbox, there is another toolbox alongside it that is jam-packed with things that we don't recognise. If we can only come together and have those discussions and say, what are the opportunities where we can do something different, that we can achieve a step change that actually demonstrates some of this and takes us into a more comfortable place, that's when we can start getting things moving. So, phrase I like to use, it's the agents of change. Who are going to be the agents of change to make the change? And it's all of us.
Brilliant. Giles, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. It's the start of August, so I think we're going to take a few weeks off for our summer holidays, and we'll be back in September.
And I'll tell you all about my scooter ride in Hamburg, because they've started off doing where you can hire scooters.
Yeah, correct. Yes.
So I'm going to have a go when I'm there.
And maybe I might finally get a cake. Thanks for listening, guys.